Information Laboratory, and also the chairperson of the Melbourne Open Research Network Steering Committee. His work is
Erwin? Oh, it looks like we just lost connection with Erwin. Well, yeah, it looks like he just had a very bad internet connection. So before we proceed, maybe just to get on to what Pak Erwin just explain. Jadi mungkin saya akan terjemahkan dalam bahasa Indonesia. Saya akan menggunakan bahasa Indonesia, Bapak Ibu.
Oke.
Oh, Pak Erwin sudah masuk?
Sudah masuk lagi.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
So Matthew is a researcher in psychology from
Okay, it looks like I need to help Pak Erwin to proceed on the webinar. So jadi untuk jadi Matthew ini adalah salah satu anggota dari ANZORN. Jadi ANZORN adalah Australian and New Zealand Network of Open Research, if I'm not mistaken. Jadi salah satu ada banyak sekali inisiatif gerakan sains terbuka di beberapa regional, termasuk ANZORN salah satunya yang lebih banyak aktif di area Australia dan New Zealand. Nah, jadi sebenarnya kita meminta Matthew untuk datang untuk bersama-sama dengan kita sekarang hari ini untuk sekaligus juga sama-sama menguatkan jejaring antara Open Science Initiative yang ada di Indonesia dengan Open Science Initiative yang ada di seluruh dunia. Nah, untuk di Indonesia sendiri saat ini ada grassroots movements, ada 3 yang cukup aktif saat ini. Jadi yang pertama adalah INA Archive. Jadi INA Archive adalah sebuah preprint server. Bapak Ibu bisa naruh preprint di sana yang dikelola oleh Pak Erwin yang tadi baru saja bergabung. Kemudian ada juga Open Science MOOC, sains terbuka MOOC. Jadi kami di sana membuat semacam kursus singkat untuk bagaimana sebenarnya cara mengadopsi sains terbuka. Nah, setelah itu yang terakhir, yang paling baru itu adalah sains terbuka Airlangga. Jadi sains terbuka Airlangga ini digagas oleh beberapa dosen yang ada di Universitas Airlangga. Meskipun sebenarnya namanya Airlangga, tapi kita tidak membatasi gerakannya pada Universitas Airlangga saja, tapi pada semua semua universitas ya, semua dosen yang ada di Indonesia. Jadi lahan dakwahnya itu tidak cuma di UNER aja, tapi di seluruh Indonesia. Kami juga aktif membantu di di INA Archive dan juga di MOOC, di sains terbuka MOOC. Saya juga kebetulan salah satu tutornya bersama dengan Pak Erwin. Jadi untuk kali ini saya kira itu aja perkenalannya. Nanti kita akan bisa berkenalan lebih lanjut. Kalau Bapak Ibu tertarik, nanti akan saya berikan beberapa informasi yang mungkin Bapak Ibu tertarik. Kalau Bapak Ibu berminat untuk mengetahui lebih lanjut sains terbuka ini sebenarnya seperti apa gitu dan maksudnya apa, nanti kita bisa diskusi lebih lanjut setelah acara webinar ini selesai. Jadi tanpa berpanjang lebar, saya kira ini adalah kesempatan yang baik. Saya akan segera memberikan kesempatan kepada Matthew untuk memberikan informasi yang sudah dia siapkan untuk acara kita kali ini. So Matthew, I think I've been done with the introduction, and also we're ready for the presentation that you have prepared. So before we start, I think we, as the representation of Indonesian Open Science Movement, we are very grateful to have you here, and we highly value your time that you have spared to do this, to help us in giving us perhaps to share your perspectives in core issues of open science movement. And now we start with publication bias, and we're going to proceed with replication crisis next month, and we're going to have another webinar in October, and we're going to talk about how to build a healthy research ecosystem with also several panelists. So Matthew, we give you the time and the to you basically. So yeah, I think that's enough for me.
Well, Selamat pagi. Thank you very much for inviting me to come and give this presentation. So I'm very keen to support other movements and other groups that are interested in increasing the openness of their research practices and support the development of more modern research practices where appropriate. Very honoured to be invited to participate. What I'd like to point out is I've noticed there's been a little bit of instability in the audio and that sort of thing. So please, if I drop out, can you shout out and let me know so I don't just proceed on and but otherwise, thank you for the gracious welcome and introduction, as much as I'm able to follow it. So yes, as stated, I'm representative of the Melbourne Open Research Network, and I co-founded the Australia and New Zealand Open Research Network. And I'm going to be here today to speak to the issue of publication bias, which is a big problem across a wide variety of fields, but very, very noticeably in my own domestic field of psychology. So let's step through a little bit about publication bias and some how we're aware of it, some of the issues with it, and ultimately how perhaps we can start to do something about it. So as a first instance, the first thing to note is that really all research is our attempt to try and find meaning in a complex world of noise. There's lots of, when we observe anything about the world, what we're trying to observe is relationships, and there is always distractions from observing those relationships. There's measurement error and there's sampling error. And these types of things will prevent us from observing these relationships, even where they truly exist. In the field of psychology, we're constantly motivated, perhaps to our fault, of examining small relationships that are hard to see because they're not really great, obvious things. And so in this struggle, we will find ourselves inevitably struggling with the classic problems that we've described in most research methods textbooks. So we detect a signal where there actually is none. We call this type 1 error. Or alternatively, we find ourselves in a situation where we don't detect a true effect, where there is a true relationship between variables or an impact of an intervention. And these are a normal part of our research process. This is an inevitable part of how we do research. And then there are the other problems that aren't as traditionally baked into our canon about how we talk about research, but are equally important. These ideas that are popularized by people like Andrew Gelman of the type S or type M errors, where we observe something, where we go looking for a relationship when we observe something in the wrong direction, a different sign or a different magnitude, where the effect is smaller or larger than we suspect. And these are problems too, and these are, what I want to emphasize, these are inevitable problems. And importantly, any individual study is not well equipped to deal with these individual problems. So the purposes of this, I've done a little bit of a simulation, and where the simulation is of 50 t-tests where there is a true population mean difference of 0.5 and a sample of 100. And when we do 50 of these t-tests, examining this effect, you'll see that the effect observed, the mean difference observed in each of these studies will walk quite a bit. They're not ordered in any way, they're just randomly sequenced. We can see that there are some that are non-significant, but we see that even of the significant results, these effects walk around quite a bit. There are some that are substantially higher, and there are some that are substantially lower. Now, this is this is an ideal situation that we're talking about here, where the only thing that is affecting the results from these 50 t-tests that are being conducted is sampling error. There is always only one effect, and it's only the effect of interest. And in practice, this isn't what happens. When we talk about our research, what we're frequently talking about is observing the effect that we're interested in within some context. And that might be a context of a research culture. And that research culture might, or the culture of a particular lab, or there might be demand characteristics, or there might be some other type of biasing factor, which means that the difference between two studies is not just and only due to sampling error, but due to other factors. And so as a consequence of this, we need to be really wary when we look at individual studies, whether we can actually meaningfully say that one study tells us anything, because that one study may be one of these chance relationships or chance effects that is really far away from the true population effect. And we can risk over-learning from those if we are mindful. So it's probably worth noting in here that for reasons we'll come back to thing, is that when we actually observe this, where there is a true effect of 0.5, we observe a mean difference of 0.467. So it isn't actually the effect that we're interested in. So let's talk about what publication bias is. Now, publication bias is a situation where we have differential publication rates dependent on the results of the study. So we mean to say that rather than studies' success in publication or publication outcomes are not determined by the important things like how rigorous the study is and how well sampled it is, but instead that there are a tendency for papers to get published more influenced by whether the publications, whether the results are interesting or appealing, etc. And we know that this is the case. We know that this is a phenomenon in the literature, even absenting our own individual experience where we perceive ourselves to have found papers harder to publish when they don't have significant results and easier to publish when they do have significant results. Because we've done meta research. There have been studies where people have gone out and asked researchers, do you report or do you not report studies that don't work, right? Don't have significant p-values? And according to this very classic now paper by John, the answer is yes. 50% of researchers that they surveyed said that they selectively published the studies that worked and file drawed or buried studies that didn't. In addition, this type of question relies upon people being honest to us and telling us when they've done something like burying these studies, or when, or relies upon it being driven by the researchers themselves. And the reality is that this isn't the case, that we know that to a certain extent publication bias is influenced by factors other than the researcher themselves. And we can tell that this is happening because when we look at the distributions of p-values within the literature, using this idea of the p-curve, we find that there are distributions of p-values that are not consistent with the true effect in the population being something other than zero. And we can speak to that in more detail at the end if you'd like. But ultimately, there are good tools that permit us to understand that there is obviously some biasing factor where somewhere between the production of the research and the publication of research, the results that are non-statistically significant don't get reported. So let's speak to why this matters. So the first thing I want to emphasize is in the context of meta-analysis. Obviously, one of our best responses to our remedy the problems of publication bias or limits of single studies is to pull the estimates from multiple studies. So I can go out and say, all of the studies that have taken an examination of this one effect in the population, what happens when I aggregate them, collect all of those estimates, and then do a weighted average of those effects? What happens to that? What happens to that estimate? If they're looking for a mean difference, what happens to the estimate of the mean difference in the population that I get if I'm observing this in the context of a situation where there is publication bias. And so what I've done here is I've actually done that. I've imposed publication bias on those effects that we previously had, and I've buried those effects that were non-significant. So now instead of 50 t-tests, I have 47 t-tests. And what you may notice here is that there has been a small adjustment to the mean difference observed in this study, and also the standard deviation of these effects. The standard deviation of the mean difference observed across these studies is going down. We're becoming more confident of the estimate that we're obtaining, even though what we're doing is we're effectively trimming off one tail of the distribution. Now, obviously, this is a not ideal example because this is only 50 observations, and our ability to meaningfully observe how big the impact this is, as well as how well we're able to determine the precision of our estimate, is only increased when our sample size gets substantially larger. But we can already see in this minimal starting point, when we're taking off those edges, right, we're taking off those significant results, that we are seeing those results, the effect estimate, get biased upwards. We are seeing a larger effect than we previously did when we were observing all effects, irrespective of whether they were statistically significant or not. So in this case, as we can see, the mean difference didn't change very much, but in the larger scheme of things, where this is an uncontrolled circumstance, we might see a runaway of this mean difference, or runaway of that estimate. Because if the true effect is actually zero, and then we only filter the ones that are statistically significant, what we're doing is we're imposing a substantially larger conditioning force on the distribution that we're observing. And so we will get a much inflated effect size relative to this situation where there is a non-zero mean difference in the population. Okay, so in some ways that seems bad enough, that what we have effectively create in circumstance where we are only publishing statistically significant results, where we inflate the effect sizes that we're observing, that seems problematic on its own, and it is. But ultimately, this is a very limited assessment of how bad the problem can ultimately become. Because where our success as academics is largely predicated on our ability to publish research, i.e. we get promoted, or we get grant success, or we get invited to give talks, or all of the other markers of academic esteem are dependent on our ability to publish papers. If our ability to publish papers is dependent on our getting statistically significant results, then we are incentivized to get statistically significant results at any cost. So the risk is that in this publish or perish environment, the tendency to impose this selection rule for publishing statistically significant results results in us engaging in practices which make our research more statistically significant than they should be. And you may have heard this referred to in the literature as questionable research practices, or engagement with researcher degrees of freedom. Now, I mean to not stigmatize these practices too much, because ultimately these are things that many people engage in. And what we'll see is that from past research, this is again, a figure in the bottom right is from that John paper that I mentioned earlier. Many of these practices are widely reported by researchers as common practices. So things like not reporting all of the measures, or coming up with a hypothesis after the results are shown, or removing participants that are outlying in order to result in in order to shift the results of the tests. These practices all have been shown by, for example, this paper by Simmons, Nelson, and Simonson, to have a big impact in whether we can find a statistically significant result. And ultimately, the engagement with these types of practices is driven by pressures like publication bias. And so publication bias not only has an immediate impact on the estimates of the effects that we draw, because we look at these things, we see this pressure for us to publish, and consequently we will bury some of the results that aren't statistically significant. But additionally, it encourages people to engage in practices which feel benign, but ultimately result in us shifting these non-statistically significant results into statistical significance, and in so doing, bias, again, that result, that estimate derived from that individual study even higher by removing elements from the tail or only reporting chance correlations, etc. So what this means is that there's a secondary impact on meta-analyses. And so it's not just that our meta-analyses that we get based on our initial research that we've conducted is compromised by our engagement with a system that only or is biased in favour of the publication of statistically significant results. Instead, on top of that, there is a biasing of the results further upwards. So more papers get pushed into that region of statistical significance, and consequently the effects that we're observing in our population are extremely biased away from the null. So we are getting increasingly strong results where, in fact, there may be no relevant effects in the world outside. They're driven by publication bias, publication of chance findings only, and also the engagement in potentially questionable research practices. And so our concern arising from this is that this incentivized system arising from this publication bias is that we end up with very, very bad estimates of what's actually going on in the world that we're trying to observe. So the reason this is so bad is this ultimately creates research waste. So we are looking for these effects, and we are building interventions based off correlational studies that may have been inflated by chance, and then consequently engaging in research directions that are informed by past research that may actually not be valid, or may be inflated, may be inaccurately representing the size of an effect or the existence of an effect where it doesn't exist. And consequently, this gets described as chasing unicorns. We spend an amount of time looking for a mythical creature, in this case an effect. And there are examples of this. The classic examples will be things like elderly posing or elderly priming, where the classic was that if you told someone to imagine an elderly person, when they left a room, they might move more slowly as a consequence of them thinking about elderly versus a young person. In this situation, all the research that subsequently went into validating whether this effect existed is wasted money and wasted time. And where our research is funded by taxpayer funding, then there's a question as to whether we are making good use of that investment, and so on. All right, so it's a fundamental question then. If this is happening, what is causing it? What is this tendency? What is driving this tendency for us to be biased in favour of publishing only these statistically significant results? And really it boils down to this idea of there being prejudice against the null hypothesis. Many of us are taught our statistics within the frame of being taught one or two statistics units in our undergraduate in some other discipline. And so consequently, we develop what's called the null ritual, right? We believe that it is destiny that all studies should find statistically significant results. And I see this in the development of the undergraduates that I teach, that even where we try to impose good values about how to think about this, there is a implicit learning that the null hypothesis is always false, right? And it should always be false. Now, in some ways, the null hypothesis is always false because it's a satire, it's a caricature of an alternative hypothesis that we might test against. But the fundamental issue is that we need to be mindful that implicitly we fall into these habits and thinking about how we think results ought to work, and implicit to that is the idea that we believe that all results should have at least one statistically significant finding. And if we haven't got that, then we believe ourselves to have done something wrong, rather than assuming that this could be a true result. So it's not just an individual factor. Like I said, I don't want to impose much burden upon the individual researcher, because publication bias isn't just a function of the individual. Part of the driver of this is structural. Many of the drivers of this are structural. So one of the big factors is that papers get rejected, and quite a lot of papers get rejected. So this is a statistic from the APA, the American Psychological Association's report card from 2017, which is that in 2017 they rejected 70% of submissions to their journals. And their division journals, so there's the associated journals, rejected 65% of submissions. And so obviously some rejection of some journal articles is appropriate. There are some articles that just don't fit the journal scope. Some of them are flawed. Some of them don't have sufficient completeness to tell something meaningful, or they draw bad conclusions. But one of the things that gets listed in a number of contexts is this idea of the result topic, or the findings are not of great enough significance. They don't mean enough. And what this is taken to be is some indication of the results don't have enough pizzazz. They're not exciting enough. And for some reason, we have associated this idea about what is an exciting result. We have tied this into our ideas of statistically significant results. And so when we hear, and so this research topic is not great enough significance is an extract from this Common Reasons for Rejections on the Wiley website, that there is a pressure for journals to publish things that are going to get cited and get read. And because we are mostly engaging in citation practices that are directed towards building on past successful results, and then successful results again defined by having statistically significant effects in the direction that we anticipate or we theorize, there is some tendency for journals to want to have more of those statistically significant results in their journals, because if they have that, then consequently it'll result in their journal impact factor rising, which is a whole separate complex problem in and of itself. So there is a strong pressure for publication bias being directed by journals rejecting papers that don't have significant results. So the question is then, how do we deal with this in the short term? And there are many varieties of what it means to deal with publication bias. But let's start immediately with the suggestion of dealing with publication bias at the individual meta-analyst angle. So when you've conducted a systematic review and you've gone and collected all of the papers that are published, then how do we deal with the fact that we may not have the full representation of the literature? How do we deal with the fact that we are possibly missing the tail end of the distribution? And consequently, what is the likely estimate of this on the distribution of scores, and consequently the estimate of the true population effect that we obtain from our meta-analysis if there is publication bias? And so there are a few things that we are taught regularly. Many of them are not great. So one of the things that most people are familiar with or have heard of is the Rosenthal's failsafe, and which is the idea is how many null studies would be required in order to for us to find a null effect. And in fact, this has actually been shown to be quite conclusively a terrible indicator, because it doesn't actually detect whether results are biased or not. And as the bias of the literature increases, as it becomes more distorted, the fail-safe N actually becomes worse at resolving this. Another one that's commonly used is the trim and fill technique. And so this looks at the distributions of effects and accounts for the distribution of them according to both their effect size estimate and their standard errors, and then tries to extrapolate what the missing results would be on the other side of the distribution of this funnel plot. The issue is with this trim and fill test is that it assumes that the only reason for your funnel plot being asymmetrical is because of publication bias. And while in principle that's actually, in principle sounds like a good idea, where there are many factors that contribute to the results that we obtain. So that includes questionable research practices, that includes random effects, that includes small sample effects, that we might find that we don't always have the assumption being met for the underlying trim and fill technique. And so consequently, our trim and fill technique, while it may help somewhat, isn't as universal or as great a tool for dealing with publication bias in meta-analysis as we'd like. There are some more modern techniques. So these are things like the p-curve and p-uniform techniques and PET-Ps. And each of these have different underlying methods and assumptions, but they have some advantages and disadvantages under some certain circumstances. So if there is, because the p-curve is ultimately designed to detect if there is suggestion of skew in the distribution of p-values against the direction you would expect if there is a non-zero effect. So if there is left skew instead of right skew, then in principle it's really good for those aspects. But what it isn't really good for is if you actually have a literature that is in fact less affected by publication bias and you actually find lots of non-significant results. In those situations, p-curve and p-uniform, which operates in a similar way, just more engaging with the distributions of p-values under the null, these both kind of fall over a little bit. They are better under the situations where PET-Ps comes apart. It's where PET-Ps is an alternative method which works okay under the situations where there are non-significant results, but where there are lots of people engaging in these questionable research practices and distorting the results, PET-Ps doesn't really work as well in those situations. The actual safest answer for how to deal with publication bias and meta-analysis is one that is kind of possibly not available to many of us right now on the basis that there just hasn't been enough history of this method, which is that we only meta-analyze registered reports. So registered reports, if you're not familiar with these, are the format where you submit to a journal for consideration a plan and outline, so effectively the introduction and methods of a study prior to conducting that study. And so they will provide that with peer review and then give you back a conditional acceptance, providing you go out and conduct the research as specified. Now, under this situation, these results should come back with substantially less publication bias because the effects that are coming back are pre-reviewed and peer-reviewed prior to the actual results being obtained, and the acceptance is conditional on the design rather than the results themselves. And so consequently, registered reports should not experience that same publication bias effect. And where we have a look at the small number of studies where they have compared the distribution of p-values under registered reports and standard publication formats, we find that the effects are substantially reduced in registered report formats. So there is substantially less publication bias going on. And also the rate of null findings, it gets inflated in registered reports. Again, further evidence that there is something going on. There is a true publication bias effect but also providing a pathway to us resolving some of these types of things. That we can use these registered report formats and meta-analysis in conjunction to try and find better estimates of what's going on in the world. So I really would be missing an opportunity if I didn't talk about the other types of publication bias. And these, when we talk about publication bias, universally, we're generally talking about is the one that we've just described, the publication of results primarily predicated on whether the results are statistically significant or not. But there is a secondary problem, which there is a very big problem in the literature of publishing only work that is from white, educated, industrialized countries, right, in developed countries. And these are very problematic. And we see evidence of this in discussion online about editors and reviewers saying that people outside of the Anglosphere are required to justify why their sample should be included in a conventional journal and why it shouldn't be delegated to a regional specific journal. And these themselves are other types of publication bias. There was a recent study published looking at what happens when you actually try to validate the Big Five, the Big Five personality characteristics in countries outside of the conventional capture. So again, Europe, America, North America, and Australia. And what happens is that you find that these Big Five constructs don't actually replicate outside of these contexts. And in fact, many problems emerge in terms of how the response sets go together. So overall, if there is another type of publication bias going on where we are imposing restrictions on where samples must be obtained from in order to publish, then consequently we are pushing our results in a way that invalidates them in much the same way that publication bias predicated on statistical significance is also invalidating our findings. I don't have a really good answer for this one, short of saying that we need to talk about this more. And so it's really important that if we have these problems and we experience the fact that we aren't getting results published because of where we're sampling from, particularly where it's imposed by editors and reviewers that are based in parts of the world that are overrepresented in the literature, then we really need to make sure that we're calling it out, pointing out this is happening and trying to emphasize that this isn't okay and this does have bad implications on whether we can draw the conclusions that we want to draw about universal principles of psychology. Okay. All right, so what are the big picture remedies to our issues with publication bias? And there aren't really great ones, but these are the most important things that we need to think about, that we need to be thinking more explicitly about how we can change the norms. So what are our expectations with respect to what we publish, what we cite, and these types of things. So we need to start understanding that we should only be assessing publications, whether a paper gets accepted based on the degree to which it is methodologically rigorous and also draws reasonable conclusions. And to be perfectly honest, if it draws terrible conclusions, I feel that's an issue that you can resolve in peer review rather than rejecting a paper outright. So we need to change the norms about how we deal with publications in order to ensure that more papers are getting pushed out. And this needs to happen not at the level of any individual researcher. This is an issue of how journals need to operate. Journals need to be less precious about getting the most exciting findings, because the more that they incentivize the most exciting findings, the more we're going to find more results that just don't stack up and aren't replicable. And we're going to keep on finding more and more of these unicorn effects out there. Now, obviously, for reasons that are complex and historical, we find that lots of people that are interested in changing and resolving these issues are younger and early career researchers. And so we need to think about what are the things that we can do as earlier career researchers where we don't have the power to change the way that a journal operates right now. And so there are some things that we can do. So one of the best things that you can do is actually attempt to put more of your work out even where it doesn't get published conventionally. So if you aren't already doing this, one of the big things that you should be considering is using preprint servers to put out your papers. This means this preprinting has a number of advantages. One is it will ensure that you will always have access to the results of your paper, even when it does get put behind a paywall. Everyone else also gets access to your results, even when it gets put behind a paywall, which is a problem to the universality and accessibility of our research. But in addition, it means that more of these papers that are getting blockaded by journals can still get included in meta-analyses where those meta-analyses include the grey literature or the unpublished literature. As we've said, another thing that will help us resolve these issues is registered reports, where we're engaging in more hypothetical deductive research, and not all of our research has to be, but where we are engaging in theory and we have firm hypotheses that we want to test, using those structures of that registered report format can help us ensure that we're getting more of those things tested in rigorous ways and into the literature, irrespective of whether they're significant or not. Another thing, if you've got a large number of null findings that journals have rejected, you can engage with these, what they call file draw report formats. And so there's Metapsychology is a journal that has one of these formats, where you basically submit to them a whole set of non-significant results that are just not getting accepted, and they will publish them in order to eliminate those nulls that are otherwise buried and missed in the literature. Another thing that we can do is we can stop self-censoring, that we ourselves, as shown in that paper by John, have been engaging in some defensive practices because we know there is some tendency for those papers to not get published if they're not significant, that we've perhaps held back more of those papers and not submitted them because we had some expectation that we needed to, we wouldn't have success. So we should try to be pushier. We should try to push those results out earlier and let the journals reject them if they want to. The important thing is that we're not falling into this trap of contributing to the problem of publication bias by not putting those papers out there to be accepted or rejected. And also, where we're asked to review, we should be more considerate of the fact that we might be susceptible to that tendency to give credit or give more favourable assessments of papers that show statistical significance. So we need to be more thoughtful and try to convince ourselves that we need to assess the paper based on the merits of the methods and the conclusions, and not be based upon whether the results are statistically significant or not. Finally, the last point on here is really important, that, you know, where we do have some opportunity to contribute to the way that we train new students, we need to be really careful that we're not inculcating them with the bad habits that we perhaps have already learned from our own teachers. I definitely learned some of the way that I engaged in research from my forebears, and they were great researchers in their own right and very principled, but nonetheless, we all had bad habits. Everyone had habits that were informed by the way that we have learnt from people prior to us. And so as you become more aware of the things that can contribute to publication bias, so we learn about the risks of the null ritual. We need to make sure that we're passing this on to the students that we're teaching at undergraduates and postgraduates, so consequently they won't be as susceptible to these problems, and hopefully they will be better and safer researchers when they go on and they teach their own students and so on. Okay. All right, so that's it for the presentation for me. I have some reference material that I'm happy to distribute, and I'll also happily share my slides and the simulation codes if you'd want. But otherwise, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take any questions or just have a discussion.
All right, so thank you so much, Matthew. I think this is very, very interesting because some of these informations might be, maybe some people here, this is the first time for them to be exposed with this kind of information, because we don't know that the way we do research actually affect the whole literature, the whole scientific literature. So so basically, we're waiting for in the meantime, we still waiting for questions. But until then, I think I have one questions, if you don't mind. So basically, I tried to do a meta-analysis before, but that was my first attempt, and I had a very much difficulty in accessing the literature, because, you know, as you said before, that the published literature have been very biased, because, you know, only significant results get published there. So the thing that I try to do is that accessing the gray literature, like the thesis and also the unpublished manuscripts. But the problem is that some universities, including my university as well, they refuse to open the repository where they keep all the theses and also dissertations and also undergraduate thesis. Sometimes it presents an evidence that not getting published in any published journal, in traditional journal, but some people choose to close their repository because they are afraid of getting scooped the ideas. So because some people would try to publish their thesis as a part of this, a part of their thesis as a published manuscript, so they are kind of in doubt of making their works public, because but in this case they are not really aware that every evidence matters. But in this case, maybe you have some comments about how we actually read the evidence from gray literature, and also to convince the audience that every evidence matters, even though it's only unpublished manuscripts. Does that make sense to you?
Yep, sorry, you
right.
dropped out once or twice in there, but I think I've got the gist of it. It is tricky, and this is the concern about getting scooped is not uncommon, and people are very concerned about having their work effectively taken them and published. There is no real simple answer for this, because fundamentally I think that there will always be a risk of bad actors. The trick is, how do we engage in practices to make the outcomes better for all people, and then how do we then separately deal with bad actors later? I think part of the answer is actually being more transparent and being more open, in that if we can make our results and we can put our results in public forums earlier and make them identified and have them be traceable, then it allows us to protect ourselves against those scoopers on the basis that we can claim priority of those results, in that we can say, here is our evidence that we had done this research before you published it, and this is actually the same results. And therefore, the suggestion is that you must have engaged in some unethical practice in terms of your taking of that data and claiming it as your own. I think ultimately that's possibly one of the best remedies that we can engage in, the best things we can do to try and help us limit the effect of that scooping behaviour, and hopefully then consequently make people more comfortable with it. Because by putting those things out there and saying, this is my work and I did it at this stage, and we can make it more transparent, then consequently we can be more confident about where that work came from. Ultimately, I think there is possibly more work to be done in terms of how we make our records more identifiable and trackable, so we can say this came from this data set. But that's a possibly a more technological solution than a people-focused problem. But I think really the trick is very much about convincing people that I think the solution is actually more transparency rather than less. Because I think being more transparent will protect us and make it more obvious when people are engaging in unethical practice. In the same way that making data more open has made it easier to potentially identify where people have engaged in outright fraud. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much, yeah, well, we have a long way then. So, well, this is a very, there is also questions about registered report, because some people were wondering what is actual registered report. Can you please give us some sort of a brief summary about what is it, and what kind of journals that actually accept registered report?
Great. I think you've posted the link in there to the Centre for Open Science list of registered report journals. It's actually, I think it's possibly over 150 journals now who offer registered report formats. And as I kind of outlined briefly earlier, the idea is that if you think about how you conduct research in general, what you do is you typically go out and plan out, well, this is the literature I've drawn upon, and consequently, this is the plan for how I'm going to test my question. And then in that period after that, you spend the time collecting the data. Now, what I would suggest, what the registered report format does that's a little bit different is it says you stop at that point once you've got your methods outlined and you send it out for peer review. And so by sending it out for peer review, then you potentially get clarification and helpful feedback that ensures that you can improve the quality of your paper in ways that you can't really do after you've collected the data. So for those of you that have submitted papers and had the experience of getting reviewer feedback, you'll often get that really frustrating reviewer suggestion that it would be better if you did a completely different study. By doing this registered report format, you're getting that review type things, suggestion of you should measure these things or you should change these types of interventions before you've gone out and collected the data. So there is still potential for you to go out and collect that data. Once you agree to that review comments, then you get a conditional acceptance. And so it means that after you go out and collect the data, and we'll speak to this question that I was asked here in a second, because I think it will be relevant. You collect the data as best relates to your registered proposal. Then, irrespective of what results you obtain from that, they will accept that set of results and that the publication of that paper that arose from that pre-registered methods and introduction. Does that make sense? Does that give a outline of that? Okay, so I'll answer Joe's question as well. So with respect to questions of deviations from pre-registration, this is obviously a really common sort of problem that we often find ourselves doing. Many of the things that we're interested in don't kind of lend themselves to really structured types of questions. Now, there are a few different answers to this depending on exactly what you're doing. In that, if you're doing a strong hypothesis-driven question, then what I'd suggest is that you follow your pre-registration as best you can, and then you just report what deviations have occurred. There's a very light-hearted piece that floats around on the internet about the 22-word statement about research transparency, and the idea is that what you can do to make your process more rigorous is just to say when you've done things that are different from your plans, or you tell us what changes you've made. And in the same way, this is very common in the publication format, so the pre-registration format or the registered report format, that if in your data collection process you've had to change your plans, then that's fine, providing you explain why you've had to change your plans, as long as you haven't completely changed your study into something completely different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does indeed make sense. Yeah. So we have our other moderator here. Anas, maybe you would ask questions, moderating the questions.
Hi.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Am I clear?
Yes.
Yeah. I want to ask you a single question. It's okay. I hope it's not too much of a tangent. So I'm an RA. So I live by grants, as does most researchers, I think. But as most grants in Indonesia, I think prioritize publication, e.g. The grants provided by the Ministry of Higher Education, they prioritize mostly publishing in international and national journals. I fear that it's going to be difficult to change behavior at the individual level, especially if people can use excuses as the grants does not require me to pre-register, or the grant doesn't require me to do A, B, and C, that actually alleviates publication bias. So it becomes a very common excuse. So my question is, can you provide an example where change has occurred at the level of grants institutions?
In the context of exactly that type of challenge, I don't have a particularly great example for you, but there is examples of cultural change of the type that you're talking about, just not in the context of that transparency in terms of pre-registration type aspect. So you can see examples of that within the context of things like Plan S. You may have seen the open access publication changes happening in Europe, where institutions have come along and said, we want to change the way that our publication model works to make them more transparent. Really, it needs to be clear to the institutions and the people that are making the decision that there's some financial incentive or some reputational incentive for them to engage in that. And I think Plan S is an example of that. Universities have realised that they're spending a preposterous amount of money on publication access for work that they're producing for the publishers. And so in the same way, if there is a sufficient grassroots movement, perhaps we'll be able to talk to the funding bodies and emphasise to the funding bodies that ultimately the impact that they're trying to achieve can possibly only be achieved if we can actually guarantee that there is some minimal standard of rigour for these types of things, or that there needs to be some sort of standard for how we test these things. I'm not entirely sure what the regulatory environment is like in Indonesia for this type of thing, but we see this to a certain extent in the way that clinical trials happen in Australia. We have a common clinical trials registry with New Zealand, but the idea is that where these trials are testing an intervention, like a drug treatment, they're mandated to engage in a pre-registration format even prior to us having this conversation about pre-registration. This clinical trials registry happened well before pre-registration became a big thing. So there are ways for us to make this happen. It just needs to be cynically in people's financial best incentives for us to do that.
Okay. Matthew, there's a question here by a study from Telkom University. Can you help me about how to do a good meta-analysis? That was the question.
Yeah, I mean, good meta-analytic research is fundamentally not that different from any other. It's really about making sure that you've operationalized effectively, and so this means having good effective search terms and good effective search strategies. And then once you've gone out and collected that, you implement your analysis rigorously and transparently. In much the same way that we've spoken about pre-registration in the context of hypothetico-deductive research, good meta-analytic design should have pre-registrations in terms of protocols. And so that way you can be clear that you're not engaging in p-hacking of your meta-analysis, which is also a thing. What I would suggest is, if you haven't already come across it, the resources like the Prisma framework for reporting standards for meta-analysis and systematic reviews is a really great tool for understanding how do we go about doing systematic reviews and meta-analyses to make them more effective. Beyond that, talking to librarians about how to improve your search strategies is a really effective method to make sure that we're actually going out and implementing a search strategy that's going to get the best possible results. Because it doesn't matter whether your meta-analysis is the cleverest type of meta-analysis if you're not collecting the right data, in the same way that if you're not asking the right questions in the psych survey, or you're not surveying the right sites in ecology. It doesn't matter whether your analysis is good if your data is terrible. Beyond that, really everything else is relatively simple, in the same way that a t-test, if you collect the right data, a t-test might be the right analysis. It's just about making sure that that data is collected in the right way and done in a rigorous format. The only other thing is doing things like double screening, double extraction, and these types of things. But beyond that, there are lots of good tools to make sure that you can do those sort of things in a very transparent and effective and accessible way. So If you haven't come across tools like REARN as a systematic review and meta-analysis screening tool, and Metaphor, the R package for conducting meta-analysis, I would strongly recommend looking into those two free tools, because they're both exceptional, and they've definitely made conducting meta-analysis substantially more accessible and more effective.
Okay. And also, Pak Erwin, do you want to elaborate on your comments? I see you thought about wanting to make a comment about Matthew's claims on registered reports.
Okay. Can anyone hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, because my connection is not really good. So, hi Matthew, thank you for making time to share your knowledge here. And because my background is geology, so I would like to make a comment about your statement that was preprinting or registered report is to prioritize claims, right? So that is literally the point that I want and I would like to make every day to our community here, especially in geoscience community. So don't be afraid to publish your research or your data prior to journal articles, just to make sure that people know that you have work on something, right? So the way of thinking in Indonesia is quite different, because people are still depending on journal article publishing. So before they receive acceptance letter, and then they would very afraid to get their data or their results out there. So thank you for making that point as well.
Oh, pleasure. And it definitely isn't just a thing. It's definitely the case here. People still aren't very comfortable with engaging in these preprint processes because they feel like it's not legitimate. And there's still definitely a value from our publication process, but we need to be wary that if we don't try and engage in new ways to put our results out there, then we may perhaps get the benefits of the publication and peer review process, but when ignoring in that process the costs of that process. We ought to try things a little bit differently, and it's good to hear that other people are having that conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. And I was making these sketch notes that Amel will give it to you later on. Enjoy my drawings, by the way.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, he is very famous in making excellent drawings and visual sketch note. And I just looked at his sketch note and it was amazing. So I think lots of people would be, they would benefits from Pa Erwin's sketch note. So thank you so much, Pa Erwin. That's very thoughtful. And also, Matthew, there's a last questions, perhaps a very technical one. So if we read some meta-analysis and they present, and the researcher only present the odds ratio, but it is not adjusted yet, the odds ratio. What do you think? I mean, how should we use the evidence? Does that is that convincing enough to see the non-adjusted odds ratio?
I think I missed the main part of the question.
So, well, it looks like, she basically just said that if we are presented with two types of odds ratio, the adjusted and also non-adjusted, whether non-adjusted beneficial enough to be, does that mean anything, the non-adjusted odds ratio?
In general terms, the adjusted is just adjusting for, again, depending on exactly where you're saying it, it's either adjusted for sample size or it's adjusted for number of alternate predictors. So again, it depends very much on the design. It's a very design by design case as to how you would interpret that.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's basically depends on the whole design. So we cannot actually have some more interpretation than. It depends on the design, of course.
I'd say it's probably not a question I can answer without having a look at the actual background.
All right. So, okay. I think that is it. I think we have run out of the time. And Matthew, thank you so much for sparing your time here. And we value highly your time and also your effort for, coming here and also talk to the public, coming in the air, non-directly. Well, before actually close the session, I'd like to advertise our upcoming webinar after this. So, jadi nanti Bapak Ibu, bulan depan kita akan ada webinar lagi, following up yang sekarang. Jadi kalau sekarang kita bicara soal publication bias, nanti bulan depan kita akan bicara yang sangat menarik juga menurut saya itu adalah replication crisis. Jadi replication crisis ini adalah krisis yang kedua yang terjadi, yang lebih yang cukup monumental, yang tidak terlalu, yang lebih kelihatan daripada mungkin dari bias publikasi yang terjadi kira-kira paling yang cukup ramai ini sekira 10 tahun belakangan. Yang menarik adalah tidak hanya terjadi di 1-2 disiplin ilmu, tapi di banyak sekali disiplin ilmu, tidak hanya di psikologi, tapi juga di geologi. Pak Erwin kemarin juga sempat berdiskusi, kemudian di kedokteran, kemudian di farmasi, kemudian di hampir semua disiplin ilmu. Nah, nanti kita bulan depan akan ada kedatangan tamu dari Open Science Philippines dengan Lysander James. Nanti kita akan berdiskusi sama-sama soal apa itu sebenarnya krisis replikasi, kenapa itu bisa terjadi, kemudian apa yang bisa kita lakukan untuk mengkoreksi kesalahan-kesalahan yang kita lakukan ketika sebagai komunitas, sebagai bagian dari komunitas akademik, supaya menghasilkan bukti yang lebih baik. Nanti kemudian untuk waktunya nanti kita belum tentukan, ketika sudah ditentukan maka kami akan informasikan kepada Bapak Ibu. Kemudian yang terakhir kita bulan Oktober sebulan setelahnya kita akan punya webinar nasional yang lebih besar. Jadi kita nanti akan melakukan webinar secara simultan, menayangkannya di beberapa tempat di seluruh Indonesia. Nanti linknya akan dikirimkan oleh Mas Ilham. Nanti Bapak Ibu yang tertarik bisa nanti mendaftar sebagai co-host universitasnya. Tapi kalau misalnya universitas jadi co-host, nanti kita akan informasikan di mana saja tempat penyiarannya, Bapak Ibu bisa datang kemana saja. Kemudian untuk webinar yang bulan Oktober, kita akan mendatangkan tidak hanya 1, tapi 3 panelis. Jadi yang pertama ada Brian Nosek dari Center for Open Science dari University of Virginia. Kemudian ada Simin Fazire dari University of California Davis, yang juga seorang editornya SPSP, ingat saya, salah satu jurnalnya IPS. Kemudian yang terakhir nanti ada Virginia Barbour. Jadi Virginia ini dari Australia, jadi beliau adalah seorang dokter, risetnya banyak soal etika penelitian kebetulan. Dan kebetulan beliau adalah salah satu pendiri dari PLOS Medicine. Jadi salah satu editor pendiri dari PLOS Medicine. Jadi beliau bertiga. Nah, ini sudah ditampilkan oleh Pak Ilham di layar, 3 panelisnya. Nanti Bapak Ibu bisa klik websitenya untuk mendapatkan informasi lebih lanjut. So, itu saja barangkali. Mungkin Pak Erwin ada hal lain yang mau ditambahkan? Anas mungkin? Pak Ilham? Mas Ilham?
Saya cukup, Mbak. Makasih.
Oke, sudah cukup semua. Saya kira itu Bapak Ibu nanti bisa langsung klik aja websitenya untuk mendapatkan informasi lebih lanjut. Nanti setelah ini saya akan mengirimkan video rekaman yang akan kita unggah di YouTube, kemudian bersama dengan transkrip chatnya. Jadi Bapak Ibu nanti bisa jadi transkripnya. Nanti setelah kami unggah di YouTube, Bapak Ibu bisa sebarkan ke kolega Bapak Ibu, termasuk juga dengan gambarnya Pak Erwin yang tadi bisa disebarkan ke kolega-kolega Bapak Ibu yang mungkin belum berkesempatan untuk mengikuti webinar ini. Barangkali itu saja dari saya. Terima kasih banyak Bapak Ibu atas partisipasinya. Semoga kita nanti bisa ketemu di acara-acara berikutnya. Terima kasih banyak. So thank you so much Matthew for everything. So we're looking forward to have more collaboration with you and also with Anzorn, and we hope that this is not the last time that we have joint activities with Anzorn as well. So yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much for everyone. Sampai ketemu di kesempatan berikutnya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.